Hello everyone, today we talk about Norman Sicily. It's not the first time we discuss it actually, but I want to be precise about the fact that this is not a video about the kingdom of Sicily, the Siculo-Norman kingdom, but part of the historical regions series, for which it's basically and generally just in an introductory fashion the history of Norman Sicily, right, as the island, just per se. You know that the kingdom stretched beyond that. In fact, I have a playlist about the Kingdom of Sicily and also for the later dynasties, the Swabians, the Angevins, the Aragonese. In fact, we will cover them in this mini-series I've started about within the larger one about medieval Sicily. And so other considerations and also other important political and military issues are present there elsewhere. For example, I made a couple of years ago a video about the Italo-Norman heavy cavalrymen of the 11th century, right, for the historical military units. I have made lots of videos, by the way, about the latter part of today's topics, that is the succession of the Hohenstaufen to the Hauteville, to which we stop today chronologically. And I still have to make a video about the Norman conquest of Sicily and other, related, the army organization videos, for example, tactics, things like that. Battles, we never made something about this. We talked about the Siculo-Normans, more like in Byzantine history, given that we're the major threat to Constantinople, even, more than the Seljuks or other neighboring powers. Because the Mediterranean does make a bridge in that sense. And today we will partly skip that aspect too. Of course, these are broader, as part of the broader relations that existed out there, very complicated and swinging, right? Also the balance between Norman Sicily and the Holy Roman Empire, the Byzantine one, other powers is extremely complicated. So we will come, hopefully, back on these issues in detail with dedicated videos. But for today, talk about the history of Norman Sicily, which originates with the Norman conquest of the island, of course. This began in 1061. There had been already Normans in Sicily, as we will see now, both for the famous Maniacus expedition, so the attempt of Byzantine reconquest of Sicily, but also as properly Norman mercenaries of the Saracens, of the Arabs of Sicily, which were also a precondition for the Norman penetration of the island, that in this sense kind of began earlier, right? This is an aspect that we should also focus more in general, how scattered these northern mercenaries were actually in the world at the time, from the Caspian Sea to North Africa. I mean, that there are pages of history that are rarely discussed, but also considering the ease, the relative ease with which the Italo-Normans at this point took over the major Mediterranean island, is of course connected to this previous, again, penetration, this previous awareness and circulation, right, of these ideas and people in the world at the time. Needless to say, again, the Normans were very present in the Byzantine army, just like in Maniacus expedition, but also in southern Italy and beyond. And we will have to explain again why they were. I made a video about the Varangian Guard for especially this earlier period. It's part of a 3 video series that I still made, only the first one, so if you're interested you can check that out. We made a relatively few actually about the Anglo-Normans that are actually also some of my favorite topics, and I just side with that kind of Anglo-Norman imperialistic mindset because it's terrifyingly beautiful. But objectively, the Siculo-Norman kingdom is, in general, also in popular culture, is always very overlooked, and actually the most important, I would argue. Surely, from a political juridical point of view, statutory institutional as well, if you want, was the single most centralized power in Latin Germanic Europe, even more than the very advanced Kingdom of England, right? So we will talk about that as well. We made some videos, if anything, about the political and institutional structure of the Anglo-Norman kingdom. That, yes, if you go in the medieval England playlist, you will find enough stuff, but we still have to do a lot, really. Especially from a military point of view, because, on a military history-based channel that is also based on the Middle Ages, chronologically, that is needed. Never talk about Hastings, never talk about lots of other things. In any case, 1061 is the Norman landing in Messina with 700 knights, Messina dominating the straits between Sicily and Calabria, and a Muslim Sicily, right? So we made recently a video about the Islamic history of the island, and we've seen how the local powers and governors were fundamentally quite fragmented, right? And so this eased dramatically the conquest of the island by the Normans, because there are some parallelisms with England. I mean, these were lands that had not been previously feudalized. The Normans were instead essentially bringing a fully and completely Western Frankish culture that was very feudal. In fact, in France, had brought to dramatic problems of centralization. As you know, the Capetians will resolve only, and incidentally, at the expense of the same Normans in the beginning of the 13th century. And so conquering a land that was, these were both crusades, right? Both Sicily and England. We will see, especially Sicily had a broader meaning in that sense. For England, was more like an excuse, let's say, a broader legitimization, also on the spiritual level. But these were, first of all, lands of conquest, because they didn't belong to the Holy Roman Empire. And so they were, kind of freer to use in a way, also as a personal domination. And they didn't display this radically entrenched feudal nobility that instead was a pain in the behind constantly for any post-Carolingian power to try to centralize the design. So that's why the Norman kingdoms of Sicily and England were so more centralized and kind of modern and updated and Statel-like compared to, say, even the still very advanced, France, in part even Germany at some point, in the second half of the 12th century. In any case, the end of Norman Sicily is with the death of the last member of the Hauteville family of Sicily, that was Constance, widow of the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI of Hohenstaufen, prematurely died, who was still, as Constance was still retaining a great part of Norman legacy, probably in the administration of the Sicilian kingdom, that her husband had somewhat accepted, given that still he was the kingdom of Sicily at the time, but there was an important continuity also with the Hauteville, and who was regent to their son, Frederick II, that will open instead the, what we'll see as the Swabian phase of the Sicilian kingdom. And we are in 1198, the death of Constance. Also, the kingdom of Sicily properly, from an institutional point of view, was established only in 1130, and on the island and on its Italian mainland possessions and beyond, right, other Mediterranean possessions, as we will see now, at the time of Roger II. First was essentially the county of Sicily, and still it was factually the same thing in terms of extensional power, but there was also a further process of consolidation, centralization. Essentially, the center of the kingdom was Sicily, right, and the former Islamic capital Palermo that had, shifted it from the Byzantine Syracuse after the conquest. And there were lots of tension with the Italian mainland that was largely it was taken over by the Normans, especially in most open plains of Apulia, etc. But in the Apennine also was pretty much Longobard in nature, and with some coastal areas that maintained some kind of Byzantine influence, and albeit having autonomized themselves, such as some maritime republics like, say, Amalfi, Naples, Gaeta, etc. But we will see maybe those in other videos. The crucial aspect of the Sicilian crown worn by William I, William II, and finally also by Tancred, as we'll see. Tancred of Lecce was kind of a tyrant usurper at that point because Henry VI had formally kicked in, was supported by the papacy, right? And this aspect is also, I think, I made one of the very first videos I made on Schwerpunkt was dedicated to this topic, because essentially there was an apostolic legacy of the Kingdom of Sicily as a sort of vassal state of the papacy, which is quite interesting because it was not part of any other domination, right? It was not part of the Holy Roman Empire, which is something that Henry VI of Hohenstaufen would have liked to recess at some point, but it was considered like properly a conquest given in fifth, even before the conquest was carried out itself by Rome to the Normans. The latter years, as we were hinting at, the succession after the death of William II brought to the marriage of Henry of Hohenstaufen, that was, if I'm not wrong, already associated to the imperial throne, or at least to the German one, by his father Frederick Barbarossa and his wife Constance of Hauteville, who was the aunt of William II, actually the daughter of Roger II of Sicily. And in 1194, the crown went to Henry, and at his death to his son Frederick II, King of Sicily, in 1198, at the death of his mother, as he was only 4 years old. So at the beginning of the 11th century, numerous groups of adventurers from Northern Europe were active in the continent, in the Mediterranean, and they often engaged essentially in mercenarism or banditry, right? You couldn't really distinguish the two. The Normans were, as mercenaries, very fickle, taking now the side of one and the other, right? And this was normal because there wasn't much of an ethnic cohesion in that sense. The same term Norman is a synecdoche. We think of them the Normans of Normandy, or some were straight from Scandinavia, depending on who you consider in this regard as Normans. Others were Normans because they gravitated around Normandy and they were instead maybe Flemish or Brittonic, or maybe they were even other French or Germans or Italians, but they were called Normans, right? And this they were exploited, and today we will not talk about in detail, essentially the political instability of mainland southern Italy that had been contended historically at that point by the Longobards, the Byzantines, and the Saracens, creating, in fact, this vacuum of power that actually could have easily been filled by someone else, right? The events of the Byzantine Empire, for example, brought randomly to a lack of Byzantine reaffirmation in southern Italy, and so the Normans exploited this because essentially the local state was collapsing in a sense. The Longobards had used Saracens as mercenaries, Normans as mercenaries. They were always quarreling among each other. We're talking about the southern Longobards, right? The principalities of Benevent and Salerno, etc. These were essentially the Longobard kingdom successor states right after the Carolingian conquest of the Italic kingdom, and they were in a very interesting position because they would retain, as we were saying before, even within the Siculo-Norman kingdom, an important autonomy, make up also sometimes an important part of the army, etc. And the Normans were out there just because, again, in the 11th century, kind of low, weak public central authority, these were men quite used to warfare, either as, say, Western Frankish cadets or other, men from those areas that knew how to fight, that had learned how to specialize proficiently in mounted combat, especially, and or I don't know, more rough Scandinavian mercenaries, fundamentally coming from the far north and having gained their chevrons in the imperial army, Byzantine army, or in others, etc., and selling their service, right, and hoping to carve essentially a lordship somewhere, right, which would happen, right? It was the ultimate goal, right, gaining local power and expanding it further. And fundamentally, the Hauteville were just some of these people. Some of them had made fortune as contractors for guarding security guards for the pilgrims that went to the Holy Land. So southern Italy was a bit the taking off bridge for Jerusalem, that at the time was being threatened by the Seljuks, which actually didn't stop the pilgrimage and actually contributed to organize better these security services that the Normans often offered. And it was absolutely normal to see Normans fighting for two opposite sides at the same time, right? They were just some standard mercenaries that came from the north and in the richer south to make fortune, right? So, as we've seen, the Byzantines used the Normans on the occasion of George Maniacus' expedition to Sicily. That was initially a success. It showed that the island could be invaded successfully, but for some internal, some domestic Byzantine issues, let's say, the general was called back, and so there also were quarrels between the Normans and the Longobards relatively to loot, right? And so the Byzantine reconquest was aborted. In some cases, the Normans attacked the Christians of Greek rite in southern Italy because they were kind of they were prompted by the Pope in doing so, and so the initial connections and the capacity of attraction of the Roman Church on these northern adventurers was already there. It's quite an important display of already how much the West was consolidating its force over the East, and also in this regard attracting mercenaries that traditionally had come in the Mediterranean just to fight for the Byzantines mostly, right, with our Varangian Guard, etc., that now were offered essentially the possibility of establishing themselves as real powers within the same Western system, and thus what you see essentially during the Crusades is that the switch had occurred. While there were many Normans, or sometimes even just other similar people, like think about all the Anglo-Saxon refugees that fled England after the Norman conquest and are to be found, say, in the Byzantine army at Dyrrhachion, fighting against the Siculo-Norman army, as transplanting essentially this northern rivalry in appearance in that specific context. And there is a bit trace of all of this, but by the Crusades, essentially the Normans were the other side, were the Westerners, were the Latins, right? So this is often overlooked as a concept. And the same conquest of Sicily is framed within this century-old crusading experimentation that at this point was actually something very normal, that we also tend to overlook, simply saying, Crusades were just launched after, 1095-96, fundamentally with the first, what we called as the First Crusade, but actually the Western Mediterranean, the Iberian Peninsula, southern Italy, had already been, engineered through this papal spiritual direction of Western military forces. That was something completely unconceivable for Constantinople, for example, that instead will make an enormous part of Western expansionism during the high Middle Ages. The reason why the Normans were also taking this kind of anti-Byzantine character has to do with the nature of southern Italy itself. Objectively, the Byzantine areas were some of the most important from a strategical point of view. They were mostly the coastal centers, and occupying them really meant a lot. They were often, also behind a quite rich agricultural hinterland that the Normans eventually would establish their baronies in, especially in Apulia. So it was a valid motive to participate to this broader Western struggle against the Byzantine one. Considered that the schism was occurring exactly in these years, 1054, which is exactly, as we'll see now, chronologically overlapping with lots of other Norman conflicts with the same papacy, but finally the ultimate alliance and cooperation. Right. In fact, the Normans did raid the same papal states sometimes. The Guiscard, Robert, and Roger, for example, were the protagonists of the Battle of Civitate in 1053, a very interesting battle, as a result of which Pope Leo IX was taken prisoner by the Northerners for 9 months. The Pope had some German Swabian foot swordmen, interestingly enough, Longobards, and Roman militias, and the Norman cavalry there managed to, it was a pretty bloody battle, to crush them. And so affirming also this Western Frankish system further as properly as a model that the Normans had mutuated from their, in fact, Western Frankish experience, right? So it's also a political and social model, the one that the Normans will export in the south, that will be essentially a feudal land, differently from central and northern Italy later on. In 1059, however, Pope Nicholas II consented to a Norman conquest of southern Italy as a whole, right? The Guiscard, for his part, disowned the authority of the Bishop of Constantinople, because the schism had occurred just 5 years before, so he aligned himself with the Roman Catholic Church, and this is interesting because the Normans had already gained an important power in the Italian southern Italian mainland that had been unstable at the beginning, right? We will talk about that more specifically, but there was a time which the Normans conquered everything, then everything collapsed again, and then the Guiscard managed instead to put things together. So to have this solid base power, also to launch an offensive on Sicily, that doesn't matter how kind of feeble at that point really was, after especially the Byzantines had showed that the Arabs could be defeated, and what the Sicilian conquest also for Islam had meant, as we will see now, needed an important political and strategic and logistical support that could come only from this important green light given by the papacy, that always remembered, had never forgotten that the large estates that belonged to the church in southern Italy and in Sicily since late Roman times, and that the Byzantines and the Arabs had usurped, right? In fact, the Siculo-Norman kingdom will be important also in the rest of the centuries, even up to the Italian unification, frankly, for the very heavy, the weight that the church, the local church, and also the papacy was just next door, had in the political institutional balance of the realm. The papacy claimed feudal lordship over Sicily, claiming to have received it from Constantine, right? So the famous and fake donation of Constantine, that, however, was, it's a bit more of a complicated and complex issue than simply, it was a fake. These popes always inventing stuff or oppressing people. But it's not really. It doesn't work really like that. And they didn't even engineer it themselves. But at that point, it had become a valid tool of affirmation that also the Carolingian kings, in fact, had originally used, because it seems it actually was a Frankish invention rather than a strictly Roman one. So initially, the Normans accepted the feudal investiture by the Pope, but then moving towards unrestrained conquest, right? And so the strains between the papacy and the Normans that at some point will even sack Rome herself will continue, right? But overall, the papacy made it to keep the Normans under control, in check. And it was important for it because, especially considering the Holy Roman Imperial Revival that had always tried to take control of southern Italy. At some point it had been checked by the Saracens with the German slaughter at Crotone in 982. Was a great problem for the popes, who didn't want anyone reuniting northern and southern Italy. Then instead was the universal plan of basically all the emperors that ever existed in medieval times, and that the Normans in this sense could avoid, right? Even though they were a hell of a power just next door, but for them it was the main and an obvious political and strategic goal was the conquest of Constantinople, that they went also pretty damn close to achieve, right? Also in later times, the Saint Henry VI from Sicily was launching that. The Angevins with Charles of Anjou later equally, the Sicilian Vespers hadn't made it aboard. So it was just a matter of time. In some way, the Normans, as you know, launched dramatic raids. We talked about it in Byzantine history all over. They sacked Thessaloniki, they sacked Thessaly, lots of places also all over the Aegean, and they were really a massive threat. And the Byzantines at that point, also relying on foreign navies, couldn't quite fully control the thing. Doesn't matter how powerful they became at that point. As you know, in the first half of the 12th century, there was also an invasion of Sicily at the time of Manuel Comnenus that was about to wipe out the Siculo-Norman kingdom, right? But eventually the thing was aborted because there was no successful cooperation with the locals on the longer run. The Normans launched this dramatically successful amphibious assault on Brindisi and managed to overthrow the Byzantine expedition. But let's say that it was that the Siculo-Norman kingdom was that heavy, internationally speaking. If we're not talking about the relation with the Holy Roman Empire, unfortunately we don't have too much time today, but I promise we will go in depth again with that. Just in partly also the reason why there was the Swabian-Norman marriage in the end. Not just that, frankly. It was also a domestic Norman affair, as we'll see now. So the Sicily where the Normans arrived in 1061 had represented a sort of role model of the, say, provinces that orbited around the Islamic expansion of the 9th century, right? Because the Arabs had conquered Sicily following the jihad promoted by Asad ibn al-Furat in 827. It was like a great prize in general. It was an important Western land that the Muslims had managed to take over from the Byzantine Empire, and from which they could threaten, together with together with Africa successfully, essentially all the Western Mediterranean, launching all the raids that we know, especially in Italy, but even beyond that. And they were backed also by the Caliphate of Cordoba that at this point instead was having problems on its own with the Tifus, not differently from Sicily, right? This process of disgregation, of this great, not really for Sicily, but for Spain especially, this great Roman, statal, bureaucratic, military professional tradition of Roman origin that since Umayyad times had been impressed, especially in this area of the Mediterranean, that, however, collapsed on the long run, while the Latin Germans were essentially booming with their vassalitic beneficiary system that, however, proved, though feudally and privately, to be more of a glue to keep things together in these older models. And the emiral dynasties of Sicily had dominated both the island and also some areas of southern Italy, as we've seen before, also crushing the Holy Roman Imperial Army at the Battle of Crotone, where Otto II escaped just by miracle. By the way, there is a funny anecdote about that. That is, he was fighting against the Saracens in southern Italy, and in theory, the Byzantines were allies of theirs. Also because there were some, there had been the marriage of Otto with the Byzantine princess, the infamous Byzantine princess, because she was the daughter of an usurper, the relative of an usurper, so rather not the porphyrogenitor, let's say, and he threw himself in the sea. Right, this happened in Calabria, and there was a Byzantine ship passing by that took him up, and they said, "Oh yes, we have saved you, we are allies," and so on. But Otto realized quite quickly that they were there just to bring him to Constantinople as an hostage, right? The Holy Roman Emperor. So what he did was still, it was coastal navigation at the time. He threw himself off boat and swam back to the Italian mainland, because he realized at that point, like, the Byzantines would have really made him do a miserable end in a way. So that tells you the degree also of things that were at stake there. The Saracens had occupied some parts of southern Italy and beyond. It established mostly entrenched camps, bit like the Vikings. They were, however, looting camps. They were just to connect this piracy operations. They weren't quite demographic settlements or anything yet. And they were possible just because the same Italian powers allowed that. I mean, the Saracens had been called as mercenaries fundamentally by the Longobards in southern Italy. Without that, there would have not really been any presence. So this is often overlooked, as if, Europe was just prey of this, external foes that did it all. But actually, if you study, and this is true also for the Vikings and the French, or the Magyars and the Germans, well, the Italians and the Saracens were basically very much the same. I mean, they just let it happen. As long as there were, some polities were stronger, want to reaffirm kind of, safer territorial domination, cleared everything up, and without too many problems. We will maybe see this in on another occasion. In any case, at this point, by the 40s, let's say, of the 11th century, the Islamic Sicilian rule was giving signs of crisis, right? And especially after the failure of the offensive against Calabria in 1031. And the direct consequence of the Arab defeat in Calabria was the Byzantine attempt to reconquer the island we've seen before. So to carry on that project was Georgios Maniakes. The Normans initially came to, at his pay. Between 1037 and 1045, the imperial expedition managed to reach as far as Troina in the Sicilian hinterland, which shows you the degree of, permeability that Islamic Sicily had. It was at that point that various Islamic military leaders founded autonomous powers, and when the broader emiral rule fragmented further, right? Until Ibn al-Tumna, that was the rival of Ibn al-Abbas, emir of Enna, in the very heart of the Sicilian hinterland, did not seek the help of the Normans themselves, that were based at this point between Apulia and Calabria, fundamentally. And so those whom he considered only mercenaries would end up taking the island and founding the future kingdom of Sicily. there was a lot of cooperation in this sense too. So even though this was clothed like a crusade and whatever, actually the Normans had entered Sicily as kind of, in part, as allies of some Arabs, and just seeing how they could profit of the situation. The Normans therefore appeared in Sicily in a favorable moment. The power of the island was fragmented between different families committed to forming independent emirates, especially in Mazara, in Agrigento, and Syracuse, in a context that now was isolated from North Africa itself. These were basically Sicilians, as we've seen. Speaking of Arabs, is quite, just from a cultural point of view, true, right? Most of the invaders were essentially Berbers with Arabicized elites, right? And also some areas that had been previously, Roman Africa was one of the most intensely Romanized and colonized areas of the empire. So we're talking about, some circuits, right, of politics, power, trade, etc., that were older than we think, and not frameable in an oppositional, Christian versus Muslims or whatever dynamic. So a first Norman landing in Sicily took place on the initiative of Roger I of Hauteville, who, in agreement with his older brother, was entrusted with the greater responsibility of the enterprise after the victory over the Byzantines of Calabria that they managed to score. The Hauteville, as you know, were a Norman, Western Frankish Norman family that had simply made fortune in this way in the south among the others, and that had managed to put together this impressive power to land in the island and successfully seizing it. The first landing involved the use of just about 60 horsemen. So that tells you how reliant on the same Arab forces they were locally. After these troops, however, that were sent there just to test the situation, Robert Guiscard and his younger brother Roger laid siege to Messina in 1061, the much larger force, establishing their headquarters there, easily controlling the straits, having this easy, defense from land and from sea, and support from the Italian mainland and so on. And in fact provided for the building of new fortifications locally as well. In 1063, near the Cerami River, there's a tributary of the Salso, larger Salso River, battle took place where Roger famously defeated an army of Sicilian and African Arabs, in which also the Caid, the judge, the governor of Palermo, so the capital of Islamic Sicily, Arcadius, died. This was the largest engagement, which fundamentally opened to a phase instead of mostly of siege warfare that was carried out for almost out of 30 years, very methodically, with very, let's call it, low intensity warfare in a sense, very differently from the Norman conquest of England, and instead was one of, triggered some of the most violent resistance and repressions in blood. It was a terrifying thing for the country, and Sicily was taken over easily, right? Not quickly, but easily. Roger installed a series of garrisons, having already taken possession of northeastern Sicily and seizing also a large booty in the process, which he shared with his older brother. And after the conquest of Cerami, Troina, and other cities, the Normans took possession of Catania in 1071, important agricultural center in the southeast of the island, then the capital Palermo in 1072. So at that point was easy to occupy. They had basically taken over all the three valleys that make up the Sicilian island, and they just had some pockets to clear in the following decades. the Normans were well armed. Individually, they had normally specialized as, heavy cavalry. It was a bit the great achievement of Western Frankish warfare, right? And it's very hardcore, intensive, collective training deriving from feudal culture and so on. But they were also supported by large amounts of commoners, especially in Sicily, where people were traditionally kind of freemen, right? And so also provided this important amount of, technical, logistical capacities. There were craftsmen, engineers, and so on. And for siege warfare, that's really needed because, the Normans were, the medieval knight was really a stormtrooper as well. I mean, it was designed to fight everywhere. And normally, siege warfare was carried out with this assault of heavy infantry. They were the same dismounted cavalry because they were well equipped. They had quite of an athletic background, and they knew how to carry that out. The rest of the troops were of support, right? So quite methodically, center by center. And this Sicilian hinterland is tough, right? So this was done really in this optimal way, one by one, and with important also material support from the local population that largely was also supportive of the invasion because the majority were Christians, right? And conversely, as we'll see now, many Muslims fled to Africa or to other lands, even Spain, etc. We're talking Spain, Tunisia, Egypt, whatever. Let's not digress on saying who these people were because being Muslim there didn't really mean much about where you came from ethnically. I mean, we have seen how the founder of the Fatimid dynasty was the son of, Christian Sicilian slaves, right? So that the Arabs had taken back in the day. So it was mostly a matter of interest, right? There was some, religious concern. However, we'll see now also how the Normans coped with still the, an important Muslim minority inhabiting the island. The Normans also received the support of the Pisan navy, at the time involved together with the Genoese one in clearing the Western Mediterranean from Saracen piracy. And this was very important because, southern Italy didn't have at that point like a major maritime power could provide in such, a orderly and sizable fashion important fleets, etc. Instead, these northern maritime republics were kind of more skilled, more emerging rampantly also in that, and they would profit from the Norman conquest that opened some markets that up to that point had remained closed, as they were enemies of those who had formerly ruled the seas there. And the conquest of Palermo was crucial because, as we've seen, this was not just the capital, but of course also the largest, most important city on the island, was a major trade center. It had an important administration, a citadel that can still be seen today, where the emirs of Sicily had ruled from. And the Normans immediately substituted themselves to this. They established also the roles in which future power relations would be based. In fact, domestically, even the Muslims would have retained their judicial functions because the local administration worked like that. This eventually would be Christianized on the long term, but it was an interesting formula because, as we've seen, the Normans knew just feudalism and they knew what were the pros and cons of it. So having this kind of more centralized system in parallel to, as we'll see now, the establishment of a feudal hierarchy checked and balanced through these communities, a bit like it happened in England with the previous Anglo-Norman traditions coexisting, or albeit modified and resized by a certain extent next to Norman feudalism went on. And Robert attributed to himself the title of Malik himself, the word that in Arabic indicates the king. This is evidenced by numerous gold taris the coins minted by him in Palermo itself. So this is quite interesting, and something that you find in this idea, of course, that the ruler had to become the protector also of the Muslims. This is a title, for example, the imperial title that the Castilian king, Leonese Castilian king, acquired when seizing Toledo, was emperor protector of the Christians, the Muslims, and the Jews, right? That in Spain were really large, the latter being very large communities as well, because of course at the beginning they needed the support of these people. And in the county of Sicily was thus established, and in completing the work of conquest, the Grand Count Roger took care to install Western Frankish bishops in the territory, which came along with lots of retinues of Normans. And as we will see, of people from most of Western Europe, mostly Frenchmen and Italians, and some Germans as well, that brought essentially this broader Frankish culture in the island. That to that point had remained alien to it, because Sicily had been ruled by the Byzantines, by the Arabs, and that's it. They had never met like a Germanic rule in post-Carolingian times, right? So this ecclesiastical administration naturally went in parallel with the alliance with Pope Urban II, right? So mission accomplished, a reconquest of an Islamic land, and an ecclesiastical administration established under the same Pope who would launch the first crusade, right? So this led also to that aforementioned unique experience of privilege granted by the Pope to the Normans, invested with his trust in the choice of the bishops of the island, which is what the apostolic legacy of the Sicilian monarchs actually consisted in. Naturally, the popes had a lot to say all the time on how the Sicilian church was ruled, right? So they wanted, yes, they formally was the Sicilian kings, that also the popes recognized this imperium too, fundamentally. But, of course, the Norman monarchs had also to choose the right people, right, that Rome liked. Naturally, the importance given to the different ethnicities varied. Muslims and Christians of the Basilian Rite, so Byzantines, are registered in the so-called plateas, that is to say that the lists containing an inventory of possessions and the relative inhabitants as villagers, villain, let's say. They were not allowed to carry weapons, right? So the Normans took over properly from a military point of view. They disarmed the masses, cleverly enough. Like it was like become the norm in the Western Frankish kingdom, right? Very few military elite men that controlled large masses of peasants that were essentially deprived of their military capacity, of their armaments. At least those that could create more problems for the mounted elite and so on. Also, political rights were factually denied to these categories. In addition, Muslims and Basilians had to pay a rent on the land, which is divided into several, say, classes, corresponding to a variable measure ranging from 14 to 50 hectares. Which is interesting because it also shows how not, extended the patrimony of the average people really was, right? It could be consistent actually for the same individual because, there was a high per capita wealth, but it wasn't, of course, there was a limit on the land. This was not a feudal land. So the average person kind of fared fairly well, right? The Norman conquest also brought to, went with iron fist on it. The situation didn't solidly improve. I made a video about this back in the day, about the Norman administration in the first decades, in Sicily and so on. You can check that. It varied depending on the areas. But there was still a control. And on the same religious principle, Latin immigrants were instead favored. In particular, the Lombards, mostly coming from the territories of the Aleramic Mark in northwestern Italy. This is very interesting because, as we will see, Gallo-Italic dialect still exists due to those colonists in modern-day Sicily, right? So islands actually of northern Italian spoken in, the southernmost language in Italy. Roger I favored also the island's repopulation policy. Lots of people came also from France, Provence, Brittany, from the same Normandy, of course, and also from northern Italy, as we've just seen. There are also multiple Gallo-Italian dialects present in Sicily, so from really different areas. And part of the reason why these French-Italian areas are privileged is because they were the most expansive in Europe at that point. So there was an opportunity for many people just to seize new land, to start a new life, having a future in this territory of conquest, right? That now the Normans had all the interest to, attract people into, right? Also to mitigate further the local influences, creating a balance, right, between the various ethnicities, so to rule them better altogether without unbalancedness. And this migratory process continued actually throughout the medieval period. That is, also in other times, say, I don't know, in Angevin times this happened again, but there was a continuous connection with this. The Aleramics had been privileged because of the marriage with Adelaide of the Vasto, and this brought to the copious influx of people from northern Italy, importantly. And the local political logic of such Gallo-Italic colonies is quite fascinating. For example, in the community of San Fratello, which was established next to the Greek-speaking population that orbited the monastery that had kept existing under the Muslims, right? So exactly the idea of, implanting some also armed communities that, as we've seen, were instead allowed to have some of their own militias, etc., as opposed to the previous ones that were kind of fundamentally disarmed and kind of habituated to the older system. And this colony we described was not among the most numerous, but it's still very much sticking to the original dialect, right? And at least until fascism at some point, because there was a landslide, the town was partially transferred at that point. But until 1922, it was some of the most hardcore Gallo-Italic communities that had remained preserved since the Middle Ages, right? The Lombard presence also had a great effect in other inland towns of eastern Sicily, such as Nicosia, Aidone, Piazza Armerina, is also famous for the late Roman mosaics, Randazzo and Sperlinga, which were part of the possessions of the Aleramics of Sicily. So this important feudal dynasty of the Po Valley kept control over this Gallo-Italic communities as a network, right? That is quite a literal one. For example, from a road point of view, it had a specific strategic logic in which they were settled, right? They were literally kind of military colonies ruled by a feudal dynasty within the political institutional structures of the kingdom. And this is how you create a balance, and you understand how eventually the Sicilian tradition in medieval times managed to confer also to the monarchs such a great power, because they had engineered this great internal stability by using all the various means at disposal. Roger died in 1101. In 1112, at the end of the regency, in the name of his son, Roger II, his wife Adelaide of Vasto established the formal, let's say, the capital of the island in Palermo. Right. This brought to some further reforms, such as the fact that great fiefdoms were no longer allowed, and the island became a sort of large state property available, in that case, to the queen. For example, hunting was reserved for her. And this is important because, as we will see, the main trouble for the monarchy domestically were the barons of Apulia that were from the other side of the kingdom, geographically, on the Adriatic, mainland Italy, that were occupying very large, powerful lordships in the very fertile agricultural stripe that runs towards, the axis north, west, south, east. And that would in fact also flirt with the Byzantines very often, and that the Sicilian army at some point had to come crush, sometimes very violently, after the Byzantine invasion of Manuel Comnenus. Bari was razed to the ground. Only the cathedral stood. Right, it were brutal means, but this shows you again the iron fist, the authority that the Sicilian king really had. There were really lots of generations spent launching Sicilian expedition in the mainland to kind of consolidate at least the coastal areas. In the Longobard Apennine, it was practically impossible to enter, if not by political cooptation in some way. So sort of broader cooperation, and those lands in fact maintained their own Longobard right. Whereas Sicily was instead kept, as the same Queen's provisions show, a much more modest feudal present, or at least a more parceled feudal distribution, with fiefs that were not too large to represent a competitor for the crown. Right? This is really important. It wouldn't really last too much in the end, because still the Siculo-Norman kingdom was a feudal kingdom. Right, so the same problems at the end of the day that were present basically all over the world of still, of decentralized administration, because there were no means to factually centralize in an absolute sense. That only in the 19th century in the West we would manage to do, but would naturally bring, especially in case of, after crises, moments of instability, to the further entrenchment of the nobility, and in their prerogatives also usurping public rights. Right, so it was always a decadent system in a way or another. Right, we've seen how, some countries in Europe didn't even make it to centralize further. The Normans managed to keep things standing on their feet, also for the later, especially for the Swabians, to still importantly legislate. From Angevin Aragonese times, things went downhill. The barons took over. Right, so also the origins, maybe not of mafia per se, but the idea still that whoever came to rule there had to negotiate with the local nobility, otherwise there was no way to make it. It was the final reason why in the 18th century the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies failed to reform towards a more statal sense, like other monarchies in Europe were achieving. And so the decadence of the 19th, and eventually the quite easy takeover in the process of the Italian unification later on. So, but for high medieval standards, this was, again, the single most centralized system that Latin Germanic Europe had ever seen and would ever see. also in the history of the Ancien regime per se. And it was a hell of a power, projecting his power in Greece, in Africa, also creating, as you know, the Principality of Antioch, of Bohemond, of Hauteville, and so on. And it has some, let's say, some characters that make it, similar to an empire, even though it quite wasn't. But it's a bit like, I don't know, you speak of Hungary that had, an enormous set of different things around Hungary that they controlled, etc. So it's quite fascinating. Also, the Normans, say, injected further Latin Christianity to the island. Right, there is a huge debate historiographically on how much Latin Christianity had survived in the island under Arab times, but most especially because it was already contending with the Byzantine Greek one in Byzantine times. And we have seen in the video about Byzantine Sicily how the popes and the emperors of Constantinople always kind of battle over these lands. With iconoclasm, there was a massive repression locally, a confiscation of also properly Latin Christian monasteries. There wasn't a schism yet, but there was still a ferocious competition. So with the Normans, however, Latin Christianity is reaffirmed as the kingdom is Roman Catholic, and naturally this had to do also with the political opportunity being provided by cloaking the occupation of the island in the guise of a crusade, right? It's in this view that the Christian reconquest of the lands possessed by the infidels, that Roger demanded legacy from Pope Urban II, right? So this allowed the Norman kings also to oversee the organization of the Sicilian church, that provided them with an enormous power, as you understand. It's not that the Pope couldn't really, he could interfere politically, but eventually how the Normans built the church locally was essentially their own business, especially in this mechanism of balance with the other faiths. Etc. The first episcopal sees were established by hooking up to the largest existing centers, as always, with the sole exception of Troina, that was chosen when the settlement was still seminal, and which soon would cede the palm to Messina, actually. This went naturally in the wake of the Roman ecclesiastical administration system. There weren't others at that point could be used, but one of the episcopal see in the city that provided with dramatic advantage. And Torino, in this sense, was for a long time also a unique case of a bishopric in a center provided with scarce possibilities, also far from the sea in Sicily altogether. It should be emphasized that Roger and Adelaide greatly favored the establishment and construction of monasteries of Greek rite themselves, albeit still subjected, of course, to Latin bishops, right? But reunited under the authority still of the archimandrite of the Savior of Messina, right? And this was part of the aforementioned let's say, mechanism of balance that was implanted in Sicily specifically. So with a still a tolerant, important tolerance showed towards the Greek community, in a moment where instead Hellenism was receding in mainland southern Italy, where the Normans weren't really allowing, in general, much of a Greek continuity. Unless I talked about this in that video about Norman administration of southern Italy, and it's been perhaps too much emphasized, especially in Calabria. There was like a great Greek element still in the local church, and it doesn't seem there to have been even a violent competition or a particular favoritism. Even the local barons were trying to keep a balance, right? But altogether, of course, the expulsion of the Byzantines from southern Italy had been a big deal, right? So this process, again, was just functional to the domestic balance in a situation where still, however, the Byzantines were kept out, right, properly from political interference, and so on, right? And of course, also the Normans couldn't press too hard because otherwise revolts could happen. And it wasn't easy to govern any medieval reality, but it's worth remembering because, again, Sicily and the mainland within the kingdom were also somewhat differentiating itself regarding these policies. On Christmas 1130, Roger II of Hauteville, after having subtracted the wall of southern Italy from other Norman relatives, in Palermo, that was named at that point in Latin Prima Sedes Corona Regis et Regni Caput, that is, first see, crown of the king, right, as properly as the city, and head of the realm, wore the crown of the kings of Sicily, right? So establishing the fact of the monarchy also from an institutional point of view, hiring the county to now a much more prestigious international level of recognition, and thus the Sicilian kingdom began, characterized still by the coexistence of various ethnic groups and different religious faiths, a kind of state with a council, right, an administrative head, the Magna Curia, and the organization of a land registry according to quite advanced concept for the time, right? So only the most efficient kingdoms in Europe, in fact also the English one, had these systems of control that they knew at least on parchment how many knights, because that's at the end of the day what the purpose was, the kingdom could levy, right? So how the obligations of all the various vassals, and we have pretty precise numbers, right, about that. Of course, mobilization is a completely different thing because the entire potential could never be levied, but still we have a pretty detailed idea of many things thanks to this. Fiefdoms were entrusted to vassals, including the important county of Ragusa, ruled by Godfrey of Hauteville. In Palermo, Roger attracted around him the best men of all the various cultural backgrounds. Very famous is the Arab geographer Al-Idrisi, also the historian Nilus Doxopatrius, and other scholars. The king maintained complete tolerance in the kingdom for all faiths, races, and languages. All they were, owning different prerogatives, was not a modern concept of tolerance as we intend after Westphalia. But again, it was a matter of creating that equilibrium among the various communities that, when one was becoming too powerful, could be brought down, and using others without making them become too powerful in the end. So you could reverse the game. It was quite useful. Roger was served by men of all nationalities, as we have just seen. For example, the Anglo-Norman Thomas Brun, that worked in the Curia, the Greek Christodoulos in the fleet, and the Byzantine George of Antioch, who in 1132 was made Admiratus Admiratorum, that is, Admiral of Admirals and effectively Commander-in-Chief. This internationality of the Norman court of Palermo is witnessed by the marbles that you can admire, still dating to Norman era the Norman palace, the various cathedrals in the island, you can see admire the styles and the wealth of this kingdom. That again is nothing in comparison to the previous dominations, right? Of Islamic architecture would just have basically one building left, and we will see how also the concept of Arab Norman art is not quite correct per se, because first of all it takes out the Byzantine element. It was very strong, but also hides, overshadows a bit the concept that most of what you see there is effectively a Northern European, it's a continental European art, right, of Frankish derivation. So this was all reflected again in the administration, even in the army, as we will see hopefully better. And you see this broader international context that really were present everywhere. The word context between the English and the Sicilian Normans, as we've seen with Thomas Brun now, but in general, right, there was this idea that, yeah, there was a common background, common ethnicity that was shared, and there were times in which an English succession to the Sicilian throne was also thought because of the common Norman basis. Also, Sicily was just something else compared to how the major continental countries in Europe were administered. The Normans at this point had established, as we've seen also, the Principality of Antioch, becoming some of the major players, basically the major players after the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the Holy Land. And the French and the German Crusaders were distrustful towards the Siculo-Normans because they thought that they had been somewhat polluted by the Muslim influence, right? There was a similar concept in the Islamic world towards North Africa. I mean, the idea of living next to the infidel, having this kind of still, in the case of North Africa for the Muslim, was just mostly because of the pagan background. And from a Christian point of view, the idea of the Normans as bâtards, as poulains, right, was developed by the Continental Crusaders that, however, really had much to envy to the power of the Haute-Ville. Sicily was splendid, was definitely the center of the Mediterranean of the time. It had great ambitions. These important attacks on the Byzantine Empire that were essentially to inflict some of the most painful blows to Constantinople, and also threatening to take the city. In theory, could have happened, right? The privileged relation with the papacy, the fantastic trade position in central Mediterranean, uniting West and East, the fertility of Sicily that at this point began to export grain everywhere, right? In antiquity, Europeans had imported grain from, like Constantinople had done from Africa, from Egypt, as Rome had done from Tunisia. In medieval times, the West was booming dramatically, and the Sicilian grain was exported every freaking where, including in North Africa. So we just know that by the 11th to 12th century, the trade balance had shifted, right, in favor. The Europeans had more precious metals. Here, the Normans expanded further on the Tunisian and Libyan coast. They had a massive asset that was really impressive for the times. The fact that Roger had made Sicily the dominant power of the Mediterranean showed also by the naval capabilities, because normally kingdoms and states, etc., didn't really have a fleet, right? Only the Italian maritime republics had something like de facto a permanent fleet. The other powers just recruited it at some point of need and didn't have major naval projection capabilities. The Normans had as well, in part because they had their own less performing but still somewhat functional maritime republics that in southern Italy that, however, the same Norman feudalism would contribute to choke, unlike the northern ones, and also because they had privileged relations with the Italian maritime republics as well. And so this allowed them to threaten the Byzantine Empire that significant, right? Eventually, they were not really like a maritime power as we intended, but again, they were the country that made essentially the largest use of fleets in that fashion. Roger had also displayed his iron fist power by suppressing several revolts in the hinterland. It was really a relentless work against the baronial rebellions and the let's say the autonomistic drift, especially of the Longbard element. And still, the kingdoms remained functionally together, right? They expanded at this point his influence toward the African shore, right? The admirals at the service of the Siculo-Norman fleet were men of great expertise, coming again from different backgrounds in Mediterranean. It could be Italians, Byzantines, etc. And this allowed Roger to carry out a series of conquests properly on the African coast between 1135 and 1153, ranging from Tripoli in Libya to Cape Bon, Tunisia, and Bona in Algeria. Roger created in those 2 decades a Norman kingdom of Africa, so-called as, say, a regnum, intended as a realm, as a sort of imperial domination, right? A Sicilian protectorate of some sort, supported in part by the residual small Christian community that had kept living in North Africa since ever, right? Since the Christianization of the Roman Empire, and that still under the Muslims had fundamentally an importance in the local administration. Right? The Arabs had done in reverse, like what the Normans had done with the Muslims, right? Using the Christians in their own government, in their own bodyguards, right, and so on. Roger, after a brief interregnum by Simon, was succeeded by William I, known as the Bad, and in 1166 William II, called the Good, but actually William I was the good ruler, and William II kind of the bad one, or at least in terms of broader success of their kingdom. Now I will not digress on the historiographical reasons why they're called like this. At this point, the international game was becoming ever more complicated, and that's also why we don't have time to digress on it. But to make the long story short, everybody wanted Sicily, and there was a dramatic pressure coming both from the Byzantines, that, as we've seen, had attempted to, even reconquer Sicily and almost succeeding in it, but the Normans had counter-struck and also brutally eradicated the rebels that had supported the Byzantines. But also by the Holy Roman Empire, that in the second half of the 12th century was really the hegemonic force in Europe, in Western Europe, and it was trying to, as you know, secure its positions in against the Italian communes and in Sicily itself, in part also supporting the Byzantines. There was a lot of back and forth, telling the truth, because there were many shifts, considering the extremely complicated situation. That's why I don't have time to digress. But let's say that Frederick Barbarossa had aims on Sicily as well, and especially in taking out the Norman presence that was still backing the papacy in an anti-imperial fashion, and hopefully installing himself on this extraordinarily wealthy and advanced power. Reason for which the task was quite complicated. Right? It's not at this time, again, all alliances shifted at some point, even under when the Byzantines attacked Sicily. The papacy was kind of part okay with that, because they knew that the Byzantines could have destroyed the Normans but never kind of permanently occupied southern Italy, and so Rome there would have probably had a big part of the share and the centralized position of the Byzantine Empire. It was also the last moment in which the popes really kind of looked at the East as a possible option as opposed to the West, because in these first 2 centuries there was in the previous centuries there had been a bit of still controlling the both of them, but Rome was also just more unitly at that point within the Western framework in many ways, right? It was not because of a Byzantine sympathy, but that's how important Sicily could have made the difference, because had that been destroyed, the papacy would have had a much greater temporal power, right? That could have been used even to fuel the ambitions of probably a territorial conquest of Italy altogether at some point. I mean, something very, fictional, because we don't know how it would have gone, but that's, again, how many assets were at stake. So Barbarossa's power, as you know, was brutally resized, as suddenly resized after the defeat against the Lombard League at the Battle of Legnano in 1176. This brought to an enormous paradigm shift that seemed to have significantly crippled German power. But there was a comeback, because at the end of the day, even that defeat was too scary, right, for maintaining the balance that all the other powers had somewhat regulated on the based on existence of a powerful Germany that at the end of the day was not to be invaded by anybody at that point. And so the Hohenstaufen had this fantastic comeback through the in fact imperial marriage between Henry VI, son of Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, and Constance of Hauteville, again the daughter of Roger II. This union was sanctioned in 1185, and it paved the way for the Swabian conquest of Sicily. Now, why did this happen exactly? Because even though Constance was the closer relative in the royal line, there were other male Hautevils that, by more distant, could claim, by male lineage to rule on Sicily. Well, the point is that domestically, the Hauteville had struggled throughout their entire reign to prevent these baronial rebellions that essentially were the standard threat posed by the feudal vassals to the monarchic rule. That was the entire game on base of which essentially a power was measured at the time. It's the same reason why the Hohenstaufen at the end of the day preferred to centralize in Italy or Sicily rather than Germany, because their the prerogatives of the nobility were much more deeply and privately entrenched, and so these southern assets were dramatically more advantageous. Frederick II would rule de facto from Sicily rather than from Germany, etc. Would start the privatization there, also from an institutional point of view with the edictum in favorem principum and so on. And so it was seen as a better option for the monarchy. This is the important, right? Not for we think in nationalistic terms, right? You want another Siculo-Norman to rule, right? They didn't give a damn about that, right? This concept was completely alien in the Middle Ages. First of all, because it's very stupid, and secondly, because it's even more stupid because it was detrimental to the unity of the state, which is a concept that we should recover today too in politics. So they preferred actually to give the throne to a German, then to a German dynasty, then that would rule the state in an hopefully more competitive, also given that that was a hell of a power, by the way, against the Siculo-Norman barons, then letting the latter kind of sharing the power among each other, because that's what also fundamentally got down to, and crippling the unity of the kingdom. That was, again, the one that had made it more than any other in Europe to maintain that unity, and it would what contain. So there was actually a civil war triggered by this, because Tancred of Lecce, who was one of these Hauteville barons of Apulia, specifically in this case, between 1189 and 1194, fought against Henry VI. By the way, even taking Palermo at some point and having himself crowned king of Sicily. He was a grandson of Roger II, so they were, again, Constance was his owned herself, right? But Henry VI finally managed to put down this rebellion brutally, right? Because there was no other way, and to secure, again, an important degree of continuity. And at that point, the Hohenstaufen scored like the biggest hit ever, because they got in one shot the entire kingdom of Sicily for themselves, just through a dynastic connection. There was an overload of debate. You can imagine all the international negotiations. Like, it was the most important thing, basically, that happened at the time. The main issue also was for the Holy Roman Emperor to affirm still the universality of power, and trying to thus stripping the kingdom of Sicily from the papacy as a papal personal fief, right? And instead, this remained dead claims, but still they were tried. Constance instead was extremely, she had a very high sense of herself, of her role as a queen of Sicily, that she always maintained by saying, yes, I'm married to the Holy Roman Emperor, but I am still, right, I bring the kingdom of Sicily, right, in the equation, right? So they actually didn't quarrel, Henry and Constance, about this, but they publicly also played on this, because they all were embodying a prerogative, right, regarding to their backgrounds, that were of enormous prestige, and had to do all the universal deal, because the Holy Roman Emperor is the universal emperor of the world, of the Roman Empire. And Constance here is a vassal of the papacy, of the Mother Church. So it's a huge issue. Like, again, it's the godlike divine power on earth, the greatest spiritual force. And so there is a bit of this, again, the Uranic and the Chthonic, the masculine and the feminine, a bit in this duo happening. But the story of Henry and of Constance is also pretty sad, because they both died prematurely, right? First of all, she had Frederick II at, I think she was 39, 40 years old, which for the time was like crazy. In fact, she had to give birth publicly in Jesi while she was coming back to Sicily from the north, which was, because nobody believed that she could be pregnant at that age. And Henry died of illness, like most, while he was, by the way, planning his conquest of Constantinople. And Constantinople would have been taken by the Germans, and at that point, had Henry VI lived, the Hohenstaufen would have summed Germany, Sicily, Italy, namely, because still they had factually lost against the communes, but they were still kings of Italy, and could at that point even basically relaunch an offensive against the Lombard League and crash in it. And Constantinople, they would have reunited East and West. It would have been the greatest thing ever. We would have thought of a completely different Middle Ages, a completely different history of mankind. It would have been the greatest thing ever. It didn't happen. Right, these are the quite unexciting things, like, the Sicilian Vespers later on, making aborting the Angevin conquest of Constantinople by Charles Capet, or also the death of Louis IX in Tunisia during the Crusade. It's those things that could have really changed everything, but not just by an accident a biological accident or whatever. There that were massive military expeditions they were headed to success, right? Yeah, these are the things that are unfortunate. And so this also left, as we know, the 4-year-old Constance died also prematurely, and she entrusted Frederick, when she was dying, she entrusted Frederick, as you know, to the Pope as an adoptive father, right, to the church as an adoptive mother. And we made last autumn and winter some videos about Frederick II, talking directly about Sicily in the process, and we will hopefully talk about him still, because he's one of those characters that really just Kantorovitz and Abulafia talked about him comprehensively, and still whenever somebody researches on him, there is something new popping out, let's say. And as you know, he would rule as as Holy Roman Emperor, as King of Germany, as King of Italy, King of Sicily, King of Jerusalem, etc., trying to collect this legacy. But in a sense, what was lost in all the struggle that eventually followed in Germany with his uncle Philip, I made a video about him, and then Otto of Brunswick, and all the struggle that led to Bouvines eventually, and the rise of France at that point. In general, the disgregation of Germany, because that's what happened, and also at this point the kingdom of Jerusalem was factually no more, as Jerusalem had fallen to Salah ad-Din, and things were, the communes were getting too powerful, the papacy was getting too powerful, and so Sicily was kind of strangled. So actually, the highest of the Hohenstaufen power was under Frederick I, factually, and Henry VI. But with Frederick II, the world had already changed. Doesn't matter how powerful he was, he ended up being still one of the great defeated of history. And the extraordinary misfortune and tragedy of the Hohenstaufen descendancy, as you know, was terrifying. And because they all ended badly in a way or another. But it stemmed from this. It stemmed also from the Siculo-Norman legacy, right? And this extraordinary empire from power from which Frederick II also ruled, as factually he was extremely proud and much more attached to, Apulia, I'd say. His favorite German land was Alsace, right? But in practice, he ruled as he had been brought up in the streets of Palermo, right, in a terrible situation, but the German vicars were, essentially exploiting the situation, terrifying, and eroding the same Norman stadtholder tradition. In fact, Frederick kind of boosted it further, but let's say the disgregational process had in part already began, right? They lost a lot of resources during Frederick's minority, and the country was invaded by Otto of Brunswick. It was a seriously messed up situation. Not Sicily, because Sicily, if I'm not wrong, like Frederick, landed in Calabria with his own force. It was very small, but he had an enormous courage, even as a youngster, to face Otto of Brunswick. So I think just the southern Italy was ravaged, but still was a great part of the kingdom asset. So again, it's painful. I could make a list of all the beautiful things that there are to see, to visit in Sicily. Here I've overloaded the video with pictures of various stuff. But let's say the Cathedral of Cefalù, for example, but the Martorana Church, the Palatine Chapel in Palermo. There is really too much probably to see about that, and it's all Norman stuff. And this is an aspect that is in part overlooked, and I would like to conclude the video with, that is about the Arab legacy, right? As we've seen, the Norman conquest of the island did not coincide with the elimination of the Islamic element, which remain numerically consistent despite the emigration of the Muslims towards the Maghreb, Islamic Spain, and Egypt after the Hauteville took over the island. The Normans, on the political, economic, and legal level, preserved some elements of the Muslim administration, especially, and that were mixed with the Byzantine ones as well. And already, right, not just because Sicily had been Byzantine and the Arabs kind of, to control that system, but also because the Arabs were heavily Romanized historically, right, since the first conquest. So they were still kind of bringing great part of the continuity of the previous traditions, both in Africa and Sicily and in other areas. So we call again the Arabs, because as Westerners we have interiorized this kind of trauma, as if the Saracen conquests in the High Middle Ages were something so detrimental, or like an alien erasing our own culture. But this is absolutely wrong as a concept, right? Not even in the Middle Ages the Saracen devastations were considered as something like unlike others, right? Of course, it was the religious discriminant, but let's say, as we've seen, made several videos about the Saracens, the political game still used them to internal benefit, right? The obscure, dark idea of the Saracen invasions, the raidings, the kind of also the ethnic change, all these things is a Renaissance historiographical idea. It was modeled on the idea of the Turk during the Ottoman Wars, and the Mediterranean Italian Saracens were something else, and the dynamics were something else. Not that they weren't brutal, or that they weren't in part destructive, or that they were a positive thing overall. They were still however, the consequence of a crisis, not the cause of a crisis. The same is true for the Vikings, for the Magyars, right? They existed because continental Europe kind of imploded, not because they made it crumble. It's a completely different thing, right? And the fact that the West simply, came back, essentially taming them and putting them out of business, is kind of the proof of this, because it happened homogeneously, by the way. From all sides, the Westerners struck back successfully, and very often, especially in Mediterranean, that it's overlooked in scale, right? Because in a sense, with the Vikings, the Scandinavian kingdoms remained what they were. With the Magyars, the raids stopped and the Magyars remained there. But the Saracens were, properly they were taken out of the Mediterranean. Like, there were, of course, some piracy, some Muslim piracy of some sort, but let's say the level of, coming back of the Western Mediterranean was dramatic, was unparalleled. It doesn't happen like in the north, or in the center. Maybe in Central Europe, on the longer run, there is a more sound expansion that is also very important. But until the Ottomans, the Mediterranean was a Western lake, undoubtedly, since the 11th century. And the point is, because you see, there was no other maritime power but the one of the Italian navies, right? So that also made the crusade and preceded the crusade and outlived the crusade. So but again, as Westerners, we have interiorized that no, the Mediterranean is something else, right? It's not like, the North that is unequivocally say that's, you can't say that there are other influence interference. This is a great mistake, because civilizationally, the Middle Ages is still the Mediterranean, right? Fundamentally, right? There is no comparison in terms of even just a concentration of wealth, of population. Southwestern Europe is fundamentally the top. It's basically what most of the Western Middle Ages is about, in absolute terms. And again, this has somewhat taken some obscure, dark, prejudicial, orientation for some, again, broader cultural, historiographical reasons that have to do, unfortunately, also with the way we have brutally mistreated the Middle Ages. And for this reason, also, in part, the success, for example, of the Siculo-Normans has been attributed to, because there was this great Arab legacy. But if we actually look at that, it wasn't much of an Arab legacy at all. Arab architecture was there. There were lots of craftsmen, of artists that used, for example, Arab motives, picture and so on. But who were these people, first of all? Like, you mean that they were actual Muslims? Or how do you know those weren't Christian Sicilians that just were habituated to express themselves according to Islamic art, right? Because they are motives, they are Christian representations. They're not, and there is also a massive Byzantine influence there that is actually much more impacting than the Arab one. So when we talk about the Arab Norman art, first of all, we're cutting out the Byzantine element for no reason. We're also massively cutting the North European aspect of such an elevated culture, neglecting it for no reason. This has been noticed by great authors also, at this point centuries ago, that said that, the Sicilian Norman monuments of the 11th, 12th centuries are mostly like a Latin Byzantine thing rather than an Islamic one, right? And the greatness of the Kingdom of Sicily doesn't quite derive from, if not in minor part, by the Arab legacy. No doubt that it was important, right? But it's not the primal cause of it. Still was a feudal Frankish kingdom in practice, and there is no other way of putting it, right? So, again, the idea of multiculturalism as being like this, like, it's not that these weren't multicultural realities, but the bias is that this is so rich and fantastic because it's exotic, because you find an Arab style, and so that's everything you can find. And the left, unfortunately, has made this consistently the point of it all. Right? Something is cool. It's like, the Byzantine issues that we like so much to discuss. Why the Byzantine Empire has come back. First of all, it's come back from an historiography that first depreciated it. But secondly, it doesn't seem there to be any other reason that it's somewhat exotic. Because it's not that, historiography is such a great fan in Western world popular culture has revived, in fact, powers like the Siculo-Norman kingdom or the Iberian kingdoms or the Italian communes as, they were the greatest thing ever. They objectively surpassed the Byzantine Empire civilizationally, but everything is, the Byzantine Empire, and the rest, it's as if, in our own West did not exist. And this is a huge mistake. I presume that great part of the problems that Western culture has today is because of the extremely narrow and sectarial understanding of history that it has. Which, again, the others shouldn't flatter themselves, because in the West, basically, we are the only ones who know any history. The rest of the world is absolutely historically illiterate, and we don't even, we still have to understand what the historical method is. So this is not to say that our problem makes us inferior to others. It's quite the other way around. But if you solve this problem, if you actually restored an objective understanding to this phase of history, as many others, probably we would also be better. We would feel much better with ourselves, right? And the same goes for, again, many other issues of how we still see the Middle Ages, and probably even the same fact that we consider it still the Middle Ages as the problem, in a way. As we've seen, basically the only Islamic building that you can trace by saying, okay, this is still standing, as it was in Arab time, even though it was remade in Norman times, is the royal palace known as the Ziza, right? We know that, for example, the Cathedral of Palermo was built over a mosque, but we don't see the mosque, right? That's literally the only thing remaining from the Arab period. So again, this Euro-Mediterranean identity should be much better assessed also in a much more Western fashion, frankly, because again, the northern shores of the Mediterranean came to rule the Mediterranean at the time. So it was Europe, factually. And I'm sure I could say much more provocative things about this topic specifically. There is also, it was some days ago, someone was watching incidentally, one of my Kingdom of Sicily's videos and said, I like this video because it's a much more, there's a lot of revisionism on the Kingdom of Sicily. He didn't specify in which sense, but it was kind of evident. It was referring to the fact that there are modern day kind of nationalism, I presume, in southern Italy in the form of, Neo-Bourbonic revival and all these things. And no, that's utter trash. It has nothing to do with history. It's not science. It just means you have never opened a single history book in your entire lifetime. But in fact, it's true. I think knowing Sicilian history is a very important exercise for Westerners because, again, it shows how it can happen that essentially the most developed country at that time, which doesn't mean it was in other times, right? Because it doesn't mean that. I know what that rhetoric is about. They tell you that the Magna Graecia, let's say, was always the greatest thing ever, that everybody learned from them. This was the most advanced civilization. Not really, right? First of all, they were taken over by someone else that kind of became the civilization par excellence. Secondly, no, Sicily had decayed brutally, but also southern Italy at some levels, especially in late Roman times, and already at this point, by the 11th, 12th century, northern Italy was more advanced than the south, and it would remain throughout till today, right? So no, absolutely not. And we don't have to confuse, in fact, even the greatness of a feudal kingdom with the level of advancement. We were talking about it just the other day about the Saracens of Lucera. We're talking about the Western European mounted crossbow, and that there was that hypothesis that Frederick II of Hohenstaufen's Saracen Guard, that was essentially these Islamic deportees from Sicily into this colony in Apulia of Lucera that became, for this reason, extremely loyal to Frederick, that had, by the way, slaughtered in front of them his own leader and make them tame, made them meek. A sort of influence on the development of Western mounted archery at that point. And there's no proof of that. I mean, this idea that everything was hyper advanced, it's not really the case, right? It's like having a feudal court doesn't mean feudal kingdoms are very advanced in some ways, but also not really very advanced in others, right? Especially given that it was a struggle between the Lombard League and Frederick II was mostly Sicilian-based, even though he made extensive use of German mercenaries already because of the aforementioned problems. Also, well, the market of war was changing by itself, but Frederick was struggling hard, where he was in dire straits with the papacy, even invading Sicily and making a lot of, the kingdom at least, making a lot of devastation. There were really rough times. Things were crumbling, right? Against Frederick were unleashed some of the greatest forces in medieval times. It was incredible, the level of hatred and propaganda, and it was vicious, really. He was depicted as the Antichrist. But again, this idea of the splendor of a court is like, the splendor of the Arabs. Where's the splendor, right? There is no doubt that, say, Palermo was an important trade center, was a large city, but where's the splendor? Where's the vestige of that? Right? Measuring civilization is not a matter of opinion, right? You have to express tangible facts. And even when there can be some systemic reasons for which something is even archaeologically not visible, etc., still, you have to acknowledge that, also what comes later in times, say, pre-industrial times like these, is the fruit of some other civilization that spread from somewhere else. The Golden Age of Islam terminated by the 10th, the 11th century. The Normans were also kind of the proof of that as far as Sicily was concerned. And okay, I think we'll have to talk about this again, because still, again, the Saracen presence had been partly beneficial. The maritime republics did develop also in terms of naval engineering, monetary, economic expansionism, aggressiveness, etc. in Saracen times. And if those had come just there as destroyers that brought everything down in the Dark Age, you don't understand why a couple of generations later you find all of a sudden this hyper powerful navies that nobody had ever seen at that point from such small powers like single cities that managed to clear the entire Western Mediterranean from the same Saracens. Doesn't make any sense. You know that it began before, and it began exactly during Saracen times. So in that sense, yes, it was a great development. It was a great Islamic civilization at some point, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Sicily was the most advanced place, right? Moorish Spain was really something else. Sicily was, as we've seen, it had not properly developed a real state, right? The Normans did much better, but because they were Franks, because they were also the ecclesiastical administration with the Muslims didn't have, was an important aspect of the story. I just made a video about that, about the reasons of the Umayyad success. That at the beginning, it's useful to concentrate all of your force in a kind of a secular sense, while you don't have something called a clergy. But on the long run, it doesn't help, because you need something backing that up with an internal dialogue and struggle, and even conflict like the one we had in the West between papacy and empire. That, however, really made great part of what we are, like Westerners. In any case, we will keep talking about Norman Sicily and Norman history in general. For today, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.